Hello, welcome to another episode of Real History. I'm your host, Steve Hathcock, and today we're going to be taking the tour of the old Brownsville City Cemetery. We're here at the City Cemetery of Brownsville, and I'd like to introduce our guest today, which is Eugene Fernandez. He's the caretaker. And Eugene, could you tell us a little bit about yourself before we talk?
Yes, I've been involved in the history of Brownsville just about all of my life, as a hobby and as a passion, and hence in my present years I'm over at this cemetery.
Now, I understand you're associated with not only the Brownsville Historical Association, but also with the Friends of the City Cemetery?
Yes, I founded that organization back in 2003. And the organization was put together in order to actually save this cemetery because it was an imminent point of failure before we gathered some people together, and hence we have the much better conditions that we have today.
You have is it an annual or semi-annual cleanup where you have volunteers come in and help to refurbish the stones and the lot or plots?
Yes, we have cleanups twice a year, one in the spring and one in the fall. For obvious reasons of the heat of summer, there's not much activity going on here. But we have volunteer groups from all over the city that come in and help pick up trash and limbs and debris and all of that, and it's a very needed service. I greatly appreciate their activity.
Well, we've always got to have a thank you for the volunteers. This is our history, our heritage, and you've got to protect the past so that you can deal with the future. One of the things I noticed is that in 2013, talking about protecting the past, the City Council passed a resolution about people being able to work on the graves, restorations, things like that. They need a permit.
Yes, a permit is essential. In 2010, I wrapped up my 7-year research program for the National Register placement of this cemetery. And once you have that status, it puts it alongside of Arlington Cemetery and all of the great other historic spots in the country. But what's important is that we don't have new and construction in the cemetery that's incongruous with the 19th century Victorian style of the cemetery. So therefore we require a permit, and if somebody wants to do something, they come to me and I oversee it. I'm not a head chopper, but I say, okay, well look, it has to be along certain guidelines, and then they proceed with their work.
Right. I understand there's well over 30,000 people interred here.
Well, there's 26,000. We have done a census, and we're cleaning up the census of the cemetery. I've got it all computerized now, and I've actually got a virtual map of the cemetery, and it comes down to 26,000. There were some duplicates before, but 26,000 is quite a lot. This is Potter's Field right here. Of the entire cemetery, there's probably 15,000 right here in Potter's Field as opposed to the higher ground.
How does one qualify to be in Potter's Field?
It is an indigent area of burial. It's usually for the people that don't have the funds in order to buy a lot up in the higher ground and all of that. It actually is maintained more by the city. If someone doesn't have the funds, if they are a charity program, then they approach the city and say, could you please allow for my placement here? And that's how these burials take place. I've
noticed that the markers down here are different, not quite as elaborate as farther up. Are these paid for by the families and the upkeep, or does the city maintain a fund to help put up a marker?
No, the city has nothing to do with the marker, and for that matter, on the higher ground, that is real estate that is deeded to the individual. Down here, they allow for the burials, but every appurtenance that goes on the spot is the onus of the actual families. Now, what we've also done in the past decade is we've taken over the cleaning of the cemetery. Technically, the cleaning of all the private compounds and lots is the responsibility of the families that own them. But now we have Parks and Recreation come in here, and as you see, they make a sweep and they clean everything in a nice manner. We're very, very appreciative of their efforts.
Do you have any kind of community programs that you do, such as tours?
Yes, we have actually, during the spring, we've got a number, we've actually upstepped our number of tours for the spring. And through the month of March, April, and on into May, we have a tour probably twice a month, and even 3 times a month in May. There are a million stories in this cemetery, and this is one that's fairly typical as to what kind of intrigue you'll find here. This is the burial compound of Michael Schatz. He was county clerk back at the end of the 19th century, and Michael Schatz got shots. He was killed by a hitman from his daughter. I solved this mystery from a talk that I had with one of my 96-year-old girlfriends. She says, it's a thing that happened to Mr. Schatz. I said, what was it? She says, well, his daughter, Marie, wanted to marry Frank Armstrong. And he says, over my dead body. She hired a hitman and she killed him. And there's Michael Schatz. This mound of earth may not look like very much, but underneath it in this general area, according to my records, in the northeast corner of the Old City Cemetery, lie the bodies of about 20 Villistas. Those were followers of Pancho Villa, who were ambushed up the river in Rio Bravo in about 1915. They were brought in, or they were carried in, or they struggled into the old charity home, which was our only hospital back in those days. And 15 to 20 of them died, and so they're buried here in a mass grave. There is no monument. It's rather bleak, as you can see, but there is talk by certain people to actually erect a monument, knowing that they are here in memory of the revolution and Pancho Villa's effort for the Mexican cause.
Gene, one of the things I've noticed as we've taken the tour of the cemetery is such an amazing variety of designs and styles. And here's one that really stands out. Can you tell me a little bit about this?
This is not only just a standout tomb for Brownsville, it is a standout historical piece for the country. This tomb was designed by Heinrich Portscheller. He was a Belgian brick mason after he had arrived here to fight with Zachary Taylor in the Mexican War. And you can see the finesse that he had as a brick mason. He went on after he left Zachary Taylor and the war ended, in order to be the major mason, brick mason in Roma, Texas. Hence you have the classification of architecture nationally. It's called Romanesque architecture. This tomb belonged to a family that was here in Brownsville about the turn of the century. As you see there, there's a burial in 1880, 1886. Mm-hmm. Well, the family had a dry goods company here, and they were very prominent. The thing that's interesting about the tomb in modern times is it has no roof. It's a complete open shaft. And I was talking to a yard man that was here a while back, and he says, yeah, when I was younger I was part of a gang, and we used to use this as a warehouse in order to store stolen merchandise in. And one day we stole a bunch of TVs, and we went ahead and loaded them on into this thing, and we kept the guard and said, okay, the coast is clear, pass me one. They would throw one out and they go sell it and get their money. So this is a warehouse, a tomb, and a national piece of architectural history.
Wow. So Gene, tell me what the significance is of this part of the cemetery.
Well, there's a huge significance for this factor alone right here, yellow fever. This sector of the Old City Cemetery was the first buried in. And if you see the date, 1858, you're going to see them on all of the monuments in this area. There was a huge epidemic of yellow fever, amongst other epidemics of the time, but it decimated the population of Brownsville. It didn't have a class consciousness. It killed them from all different segments of our society. You have Mifflin Kennedy's brother buried right back over there. You had Simone Celaya's family over here. You had original land grant families, the Santascoy Trevino's over there. So this area right here is the original placement, the start of the Old City Cemetery, with inclusive of the oldest burial that's here, 1849.
Well, they say the grave is the great equalizer. You know, it wasn't much longer after that they established a quarantine station over at Brazos, Santiago. And when the ships would come in, the passengers, if they had come from an area that had cholera or yellow fever, a variety of different diseases, they would have to be quarantined. And initially, they would have to stay aboard their ship, and they had to pay the county 50 cents per passenger to get a release. They had to stay there for 21 days. And the doctors were getting paid $10 a day to come over and check with them. Later, they built a quarantine station on Clark Island, which is it's now connected with Boca Chica Beach, but at that time there was a tidal channel through there. And they had a pretty big hospital there, and they could support anywhere up to a couple hundred people at a time. Wow. And then ultimately they built the quarantine center in the bay over there near the South Padre Island Coast Guard Center. And it burned down sometime in the 20s.
Now, on the real tour that's sought after by a lot of people is the Scare Your Pants Off of You tour. And that's in right around Dia de los Muertos, around Halloween. And that's at night.
I understand that there are stories of various ghosts. I heard about the little girl who had been fallen off a horse who makes appearances.
Yeah, she was my cousin.
Can you tell us about her?
Yes, what happened is that Daisy Stark was the daughter of Frederick Stark and Maria Vicenta Stark. Their other son married my cousin. That's how we're related. But the family was out on Elizabeth Street, and this was going into about 1870s in that region, and the little girl was in charge of was in the care of the maid, and they were watching a parade, and the maid got distracted for a moment, and the little girl got in the way of a carriage, and the carriage ran over her and crushed her and killed her.
What a tragedy.
At that point in time, the maid, this is from the family history, the maid went berserk, ran for the river, jumped in the river, and went across into Mexico, and the tale was that she went insane.
What a tragedy for,
and then, of
for
course,
the family
Daisy's,
and for her too.
And Daisy's little ghost has been seen by a number of people, including our groundskeeper here.
Does she try to communicate, or is she just wandering?
No, she doesn't try to communicate at all, but she's very, very watchful of her little zone. And hence you have the collection of little toys. I'll show you in a moment what it looks like, but she's mischievous, you might say.
Well, there it is, folks. We're here at the Brownsville City Cemetery with Eugene Fernandez, the man that not only knows where the bodies are buried, but he's actually the guy who takes care of their plots. We're here in the Hebrew Cemetery now, and Gene's going to tell us a little bit about their impact on early Texas and Texas history.
This may not look anything like the other section of the cemetery, quite noticeably. If you look back and you see, okay, it's all maintained. When I bring the young ones here from the school district, I ask them, what do you think the difference is? And they say, oh, it's modern. Not at all. In fact, this cemetery was founded at the very same time that the other portion was founded. And one of the original founders was the first one buried here, and he's back on the back wall. If you look at the stones, you're going to see the signs in Hebrew and the language of their people, and also you're going to see another telltale point, and it is their origin, where they came from. A lot of these were Eastern Europeans. A lot of them came out of those lands at the times of various wars to seek their freedom here in the New World.
So Gene, tell me a little bit about how you got listed on the National Register.
Well, it took 7 years to do it. I thought that I knew a lot about the cemetery when I started this back in 2003, but we got this plaque actually unveiled in the year 2010, and it qualified above and beyond what would normally be necessary for National Register significance by, of course, its historic background and who's buried here.
What's the advantage of being listed on the National Register of Historic Places?
Well, number one, it is a hard-fought honor, and by having National Register status, you are in a league that is worldwide, and then that makes you available, makes grants available to you, you're running in an entirely different higher echelon of historically significant sites.
One last question, Gene. Say that one of our viewers wants to know if one of their relatives is buried in the cemetery. Is there a place where they can go and ask, or they can look at the list of the occupants of the different tombs?
Just so happens you're with the person that has the master list. I took all of the burials that are registered for the cemetery, there's 26,000 of them, and I compiled them into a database, and it's all computerized. So all you need to do is give me your last name of your loved one, your great-grandfather, your grandfather, whatever, and then if a year of the death, and I can go through my records and find that individual. Plus, the other individuals that are with your family, and the basic information as to what they died of, what their occupations were. So it's a virtual treasure trove of information.
It really sounds like it. If I were searching my genealogy and it's at night, is there any way I can tap into that file of yours online?
It's not a public file. It has to be done in our office.
By request.
We eventually plan on putting it online, but that is not for the immediate future.
Is there a fee
No.
for that? But do you accept donations for the Friends of the Cemetery?
Yes, for the Brownsville Historical Association, we're always welcoming any donations, but all of this research, anything that involves the cemetery, being that we are the owners of the cemetery, we do without a cost whatsoever.
Folks, there we have it from Eugene Fernandez. We have our tour of the cemetery, a little bit of history of Brownsville, and we're looking forward to having you on our show again. Thank you. This is Steve Hathcock with Rio History, wishing you all the best, and catch our next episode.